wonderful to be here, and I would like to start by thanking people. First of all, I'd like to thank the ISTP. Over this week, I've been really stimulated by conversations and by some really thought-provoking papers, including the keynotes, which I found very inspiring. So I'd like to thank the ISTP, I'd like to thank the local organisers who've done a lot of work here. And I'd like to thank Dr. Marie, for introducing me and hosting me, but also for that very lovely introduction, thank you. And I'd like to thank other colleagues in Denmark. I've spent a lot of time here in Roskilde University, and also here at DPU. And that's really influenced my thinking. And I think that sometimes it's not clear how much people have influenced you. So I want to thank people there. I want to be thankful for language. I'm the only keynote this week for whom English is a first language, and indeed, to my shame, an only language as well. And I think, again, we English speakers don't realize how much effort it takes other people, or sometimes we don't realize, to have to prepare in advance rather than the night before. I didn't prepare the night before, only actually. I've put more effort into it than that. So I'm really grateful for that. And I'd like to thank all of you. I didn't expect to see so many of you on a Friday morning after the night before. So thank you for coming. And I want to just briefly reprise and Baudelairize what some of the other keynotes have said. So in terms of social acceleration, the theme of this conference, Rosa and colleagues have done a lot of work on this, obviously, over the last 20 years or so. And one of the key points that's important for what I have to say that he makes is that there is a dynamic stabilization. And that entails a logic of incessant escalation, but it has within itself the seeds of destabilization. And in this 2016 paper, they're concerned with a post-growth society. It can't go on forever. And from Dr. Marie Sondergaard, really thinking about the way in which we have to think in more complex ways about social acceleration, and using new materialism and agential reading with a return to the human, and thinking about entanglements with technology. So all of those things I think are important, obviously important in themselves, but for what I want to think about today as well. And then the lovely poetics that we had yesterday, which brought in from Pablo Oyarzun, and he's just come in time to hear me mangle his name, temporality, historicity, complexity, dislocation, different velocities, as well as, and I think a really important point for me, the present being separated from itself, and the experience of a present to come being important too. So what do I want to do? I want, first of all, to think about the way in which social acceleration is long-standing, and that has an impact, because ideas, in Gramscian ways, sediment into common sense. They're part of the legacy that we live with. And I want to do that by thinking about Francis Galton and his legacy. And I would argue it's timely to do that. And I then want to think about the ideological impact of that sort of work. I then want to go on to give 3 examples of measurements that reproduce unequal power relations through fixity. And I hope it will become clear what I mean in looking at parenting styles, unconscious bias, and algorithms. And then I want to think about possibilities for change. And I want to do that very briefly by thinking about a rethinking of statistics. And don't worry, I'm no statistician, so I'm not going to be mangling statistics, but I want to say something about that. And I also want to say a little about insider perspectives. So number 1, first of all, long-standing social acceleration. And what I want to argue overall is that psychological theorizing serves frequently to maintain the political status quo, the status quo in relation to power relations. And in doing so, it also refuses some possible futures. And that theorizing incorporates complexity, yes, but it incorporates complexity at the level of the global and the local in terms of those relationships, and to do with intersectional positionality, to do with epistemic violence, and I'll say what I mean by that in a moment. And that fixity is produced when measurement is accelerated or technology is accelerated. And fixity itself is systemically, so at the level of systems at different levels, it's dynamic too. And it's dynamic for people, it's dynamic for measures, and it's dynamic for social positioning. But always, in those contexts, difference and dissent come to the fore, however quietly. And what they do is open spaces for social change and new becomings. So that's what I'm going to argue. So if you're feeling particularly tired, you could leave now and know that you've heard it all. Okay. But I want to begin with my first area by thinking about the 19th century and accelerated social change. And we had a little bit of thinking about that yesterday. So in 1754, in the United Kingdom, the Royal Society of Arts and Manufacture, the building in the, on the left, came into being. 1754. So interested in arts and manufacturing. And the picture on the right is of the 1851 Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of All Nations. And that was held in London. And to quote, to make clear to the world the UK's role as industrial leader. Okay, so quite a small aim. And there were these sorts of exhibitions in other countries as well. And industrial capitalism led to huge change in the ways in which families were organized, what they did, and also in education, as well as many other things. It took place and was possible, it was made possible through colonial subjugation, bureaucracy, and administration. And indeed, if Trump succeeds in buying Greenland, we'll see other developments, perhaps. I am being flippant. But, you know, in 1899, Veblen, who is a Norwegian-American, talked about conspicuous consumption, the way in which the changes wrought by industrialization and so on had changed relations between the classes, so that the bourgeoisie, who could afford things, were continually chasing the landed aristocracy, who kept changing their consumption in order to get away from the bourgeoisie, copying their style. And the growth of cities was also crucially important. So Simmel, who's well known for writing about this at the turn of the previous century, he talks about the way in which the growth of cities had psychological impacts. So an intensification of emotional life due to the swift and continuous shift of external and internal stimuli. And the metropolis creating psychological conditions, and also that there was resistance of the individual to being leveled, swallowed up in the social technological mechanism. So cities as characters, really, affecting how we all live and our psychologies. And in the 19th century as well, this accelerated social change is linked with accelerated psychological measurement. And for those of you who are psychologists, these are stories you know very well. So William James, let's start with Wundt, who opened what came to be seen as the first psychological laboratory. In fact, before he formally opened that, the university at Leipzig had given him a room as a laboratory that he stored things in. But he opened, 1879 is usually dated as the birth of experimental psychology. And in the US, William James, brother of Henry, published a book I still cannot believe could be so big, and of which I've only read a part, 1,200 pages of Principles of Psychology. And he's certainly credited with inaugurating social psychology, and as well as psychology in the US more generally. But it's to Francis Galton I wish to turn. And the argument I want to make here is that measurement is produced in the service of social beliefs and global local positioning. So Francis Galton, he's the cousin of Charles Darwin, with rather different views, and he was a polymath. He did a lot of things, a bit of a dilettante. He had a lot of money, so he didn't need to tie himself to a position, but could be very influential, and he did a lot of things, okay? But the thing that I'm particularly exercised by at the moment is his eugenicist views. Does that translate, actually? Since it's not a word necessarily in everyday usage, some people are shaking their heads. So eugenics, you will know, because also in Scandinavia there were eugenic movements, about belief in breeding the best possible human traits and breeding out those that were not the best possible. Many people who work in genetics are incensed that people would think that eugenics is only, for example, racialized, so that it's about race and disability and so on. But obviously, those who set up the Eugenics Society and belonged to it and so on were very exercised by those issues. So to do with disability, to do with race, and so on. Okay? But eugenics is about sort of improving the stock. Okay? And Francis Galton, many of us will have been taught, is the father of individual differences in psychology. He was a co-founder with people like Maurice Stopes, who wrote about married love and contraception for women and so on. He was a co-founder of the Eugenics Society, and he left money for a professorship in eugenics at UCL, where I work. And here's his first anthropometric laboratory. He believed very much in measuring things. So he had this laboratory and would like the public to come in to be measured. And indeed got a lot of measurements of all sorts of things, heads and so on, anyway. Always in the background for Galton were notions of ableism, sexism, and commitments to eugenics, to do with race. This is a copy of his notebook, clearly not his writing, but it's what it looked like and typed up, just a tiny bit of it. And you'll see that he's interested in gender because he thinks males are important, much more than women, but also that race continually creeps in. So a woman of a Negro tint crossed out towards a negress when you're talking about attractiveness and so on. But also measurement, so that he has done some rough and provisional measurements about the attractiveness, what attracts men to women. And here is his 1869 book, which is freely available online now because it's obviously no longer in copyright, and it's called Hereditary Genius, which is, we would look back on now and be a little surprised by. But the point I'm making here is that, just the beginning bit, the idea of investigating the subject of hereditary genius occurred to me during the course of a purely ethnological inquiry into the mental peculiarities of different races. Okay? So race always foregrounded, but here families as well. He's interested in the ways in which genius is passed down through families. If you are an eminent man, you're much more likely to have sons who are eminent than if you're not. Okay, so genius is clearly hereditary. Okay, now people say, that is the past. He was of his time. People say all the time. Okay? So we could see it just as unconscious bias, but we cannot. And one of the reasons that we can't is, of course, there are always counter-narratives, and there were strong counter-narratives to his eugenics beliefs. So I'm indebted to this, for this to Thomas Leonard, who is now emeritus professor of statistics, but who's also a writer and a poet, and he was a professor at Wisconsin-Madison, but also in London. And he points out that there were many eminent men who really did not believe in this eugenics argument at all. They were very against it. And even though the British government brought in the 1913 Mental Deficiency Act, which was very much based on eugenic-type principles, that there were many who spoke against it. It was not a foregone conclusion at all, okay? And you could see some of those who did there, as well as those who were havering. So Tom Leonard suggests that Aldous Huxley is a controversial figure here because he did support eugenics before he wrote Brave New World, but that many people came to see him as anti-eugenic. There also were, of course, shifts in thinking that came about through contestation, through historical change, and just the passage of time. And if you take the name of the journal that was established at UCL, it was, first of all, the Annals of Eugenics, a journal for the scientific study of racial problems, and that was edited by Carl Pearson, who you will know for his statistical contributions. And then it became the Annals of Eugenics, a journal devoted to the genetic study of human populations, and that's Fisher, who also you'll know for his contributions to statistics. And then when Lionel Penrose took over the eugenics chair, it became the Annals of Eugenics, a journal of human genetics. And then in 1954, he changed it again to the Annals of Human Genetics. But you see, it started off overtly about race and eugenics. And of course, you'd be right to say that race had broad meanings, but it certainly also had the racialized meanings too. So that was in the past, until the media broke a story about what students at UCL, where I work, were complaining about in 2018, which I think you'll agree is not that historically far back. And it was about the fact that the students knew that for at least 3 years, somebody who had an honorary lecture at UCL and so is entitled to do all sorts of things, had been holding eugenics conferences. And the fallout from that, not just from student protests, but it was students at the heart of this, was such that UCL has launched an investigation into the history of eugenics at UCL and its legacy, which is still ongoing. I'm on that commission and will report in January. So we've been taking a lot of evidence and doing all sorts of things, and it's absolutely fascinating. So ideas, the point I'm making is that there are historical conditions of possibility, and as Gramsci suggests, these ideas do sediment into common sense for some, however contested. So ideas have genealogies, as Foucault has pointed out to us, legacies, and they are also recursive. And I certainly think that that's an example of why we need to de-individualize ethics, as Dr. Marie Sondergaard suggested a couple of days ago. So that's Galton, and I want to think a bit about the ideological impact. In order to do that, I want to just lay out some of the theoretical issues that I'm talking about. So becomings. Becomings and temporality have entered into many different disciplines or used a great deal. So they're theoretical commonplaces. For things that I'm concerned with, the sociology of childhood started really from resistance to developmental psychology because of its focus on children as having potential for becoming. So children and parents are sites of intervention because of who children can become. And what the sociology of childhood wanted to say is not that becoming is not important, but that being is also important. So being and becoming both are crucial. But also identities, which I'm very concerned with. The question of what we can become is central to identity. Okay, so Stuart Hall put that very elegantly, but lots of people do in that field. And Elizabeth Gross, who's an Australian feminist philosopher, thinks about time as lived experience, as many people do, and she draws on Bergson's concept of duration to do that, and the notion that the past is always moving on. So it's constantly re-experiencing the present, it's open to the future, and the actual and the possible exist together, and they're only separated by the process of reaching some and realizing some possibilities and not others. So, at any one point, there are multiple possible becomings. And I like that way of thinking, partly because I also like narrative theory, which thinks about the past, the present, and the future as all simultaneous and as all changing. As our potential futures change, so does the way in which we understand our present, and the past also changes. Okay, so this is a quote from Gross. Unless we develop concepts of time and duration which welcome and privilege the future, which openly accept the rich virtualities and divergent resonances of the present, we'll remain closed to understanding the complex processes of becoming that engender and constitute both life and matter. Okay, so that's becomings. Intersectionality, coined by Kimberlé Crenshaw in 1989, but ideas that were already circulating, and that one of perhaps the fastest growing theoretical construct in the academy across a lot of disciplines. And the point about it is that everybody belongs simultaneously to multiple social categories, everybody does, and that those are dynamic and they mutually constitute each other and obviously change over time as categories change over time, and our understanding of them does. And as Cho, Crenshaw, and McCall suggest, this is not as these categories are not as distinct, but always permeated by other categories, fluid and changing, always in the process of being created, and crucially, created by dynamics of power. And then epistemic violence, which I also said I'd say something about, and that's Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, drawing on Foucauldian ideas about epistemic violence as the imposition of one set of beliefs over others, so that power and knowledge are always part of the dynamics there. And for Spivak, it's to do with when the post-colonial discourse, it arises, when post-colonial discourse is such that the subaltern, those at the bottom of society, is silenced by both the colonial and indigenous patriarchal power. So that it's a process of silencing that's epistemically violent. And I want to argue that informal knowledge, the things that are known, whether they're brought out onto the table or not, informal knowledge produces epistemic violence and often separate people who know that they're positioned in different sides of epistemically violent knowledge. Okay, and what I want to argue from having thought about Galton is that measurement continually reproduces social inequalities, it has ideological impacts, because it reinforces already existing power relations, and it reinforces bias, even though that bias is contested, okay? And it is often outsider impositions, not always, because insiders can produce epistemically violent knowledge as well, but there's often outsider impositions of this. And what it serves to do is to naturalize inequalities. It's just the way things are. As Galton would have thought, it just is that women are inferior, that black people are inferior, that Africans are inferior, and that you shouldn't have the white race spoiled by those with disabilities. Okay. It also serves to depopulate social psychology, because if one thinks about people in terms of measurement and results, then, as Billig pointed out so nicely, you don't think about subjectivities, you don't understand what the actual people in these social experiments or tests and so on are like. And it results in fixity rather than in dynamic becomings, although I would also argue that fixity is itself dynamic. And it certainly runs counter to one of the major ways in which there is a commonplace understanding of the world that becomings are important. But always there are counter-narratives, and those counter-narratives are crucial for producing possibilities of change. And the ways in which ideological impact, however well-intentioned, produce dynamic fixity. To give some examples, in psychology, as you know, issues about race and intelligence pop up all the time. I mean, they're recursive. They're silenced by some. They come back in different guises all the time. There are also debates about attainment by ethnicity. Okay? And indeed, an intersectional perspective is crucial because if you go to different countries, you find that one group who is taken for granted as just not being able to do well in school in one country is doing very well, while another group is doing very poorly. Okay? And unless one thinks that that there's such selective migration that if you're going to do poorly in school, you go to this country, and if you're going to do well, you go to that country, then I think we need a more complex understanding. But what has really surprised me are the number of students, black students, who are now saying that something about, knowing about attainment by ethnicity, knowing that in the British context, black African Caribbean, not black African, but black African Caribbean, Bangladeshi, but much less so now, students, always gypsy students, do really poorly at school, and the white working class boys, although people don't know what to do with that knowledge quite often, that's meant to help us make the education system better. It's meant to help us produce better equality of outcomes. But a number of black students are saying, are writing about, are blogging about the fact that their university tutors tell them, well, black students don't do well here at this university. They don't do well at university. And feeling that they are marked down, that less is expected of them, and that they're treated differently. As well as the evidence that we have that, for example, black middle-class parents have to work much harder with teachers in order to show teachers that their children have what Annette Leroux would call concerted cultivation, that they have the ability and all the social capital to do really well. I mean, so Nicola Rollock and colleagues' study of the black middle class is very helpful there. But it brings up issues of stereotype threat that Steele and Aronson first identified, which suggests that if you're in a category that is not expected to do well at something, so for example, women at maths, black students at anything, that there's a general threat in the room when you're tested, and that can be changed by having testers who don't subscribe to that. So it's not just having a woman tester or a black tester, but that you have to know that those people don't expect that you'll automatically do badly. So stereotype threat. It's also the way that Sara Ahmed theorizes bodies out of place, that some bodies are remarkable when they are in particular places. They are noticed, okay, as being matter out of place. And many black academics write about the way in which, or talk about the way in which, they're always thought to be, however they're dressed, the cleaner or the secretary or something like that, okay. So bodies out of place, which are taken to signify the potential for achievement. And what that does is to fix black students in positions of incapacity. It makes it much more complicated to think about what to do to equal the playing field. And it also makes education about reproduction rather than becomings. It's also linked to exceptionalism, so you can't win. if, as a black student, you do well, it's not because you're you and black as an integral part of you, but it's because you're exceptional, okay? You're not the same as them, okay? So, of course, it's allowed that you do well. But also essentializing notions of authenticity. And I just wanted to give a couple of examples of that, not from psychology at all, but Mallory Blackman, who's a children's author, and who was the Children's Laureate in Britain until recently. This is an article, a BBC News piece that's dealing with authors' rejections. And she points out that one of her novels was rejected because it deals with racial discrimination. It was rejected for a literary award because it wasn't insightful enough. It wasn't insightful enough because if she'd been white and written about racial discrimination, it would show that she had some insights. She'd had to imagine it. But, you know, she's black, so there's no imagination or insight there. So it was turned down for a literary award. And another black writer, Courtier Newland, says that he was turned down on the grounds that he'd put in black people eating spaghetti bolognese. And we all know that black people never eat spaghetti bolognese. So, you know, you get these, you know, I wanted to show those examples because they're ridiculous. But of course, the examples that are not ridiculous are implicit and they're not seen. Okay. So I want to move on now to give 3 examples of measurements reproducing unequal power relations, and I'll do this fairly fast. So first of all, thinking about parenting styles. And I wanted to show this, the attachment style matrix, and the which is developed from Mary Ainsworth's work, and the parenting styles matrix, which is developed from Diana Baumrein's work. And I wanted to show this to make the point about how limited in our thinking we as psychologists are. It's astonishing how many measures end up in a 2-by-2 matrix. You know, so of course there is, as Julia Kristeva says, intertextuality. Our frames are intertextual. We're picking up from one another. But, you know, does it say something about our thinking that this is what we can come up with? But parenting style, in a way, it really doesn't matter what it is. But Diana Baumrein, in 1966, from lots of observations of parents and children, came up with really 4 types of parenting style. The authoritarian or disciplinarian, the permissive or indulgent, the uninvolved, and the authoritative. And study after study, hundreds, thousands, have found that there's a link between being authoritative in your parenting style and producing children with good outcomes who do well at school, etc., etc. Okay, so the authoritative parenting style is the gold standard one. And all this is to do with how you discipline your children, how you communicate with them, how you nurture them, so in other words, you know, help them to develop cognitively and so on, and what you expect of them. Okay, so these 4 styles. And the point that I'm wanting to make is that there are also hundreds of publications that show that these the authoritative parenting style works well for the white middle classes. It doesn't necessarily work well for other groups in the United States where it was developed or out of the United States either. So that different styles might be important. So the authoritarian style seems to be important for African American working class people who live in dangerous neighborhoods. It seems to work better than an authoritative style for keeping children safe and for how they develop. And so on. It doesn't work for Hispanics either in the United States, doesn't work for Spanish people in different places, and so on. So it's not quite as universal as you'd think, and it fits with what I've called a normalized absence, pathologized presence view, because what people frequently still do is when they're wanting to think about the normative, they go and study white middle-class parents and children. But when they're wanting to think about the exceptional, the problematic, they include in lots of other kinds of parents and children. So you get a normalized absence of groups who are already deemed problematic and a pathologized presence. They're already pathological, and they add to the pathology and have no opportunity to shift and extend the normative by what they're like. Okay, so here just a quick quote from Russell and Crockett and Chow. This work has drawn attention to diversity in the cultural meaning of parenting across ethnic and cultural groups and subgroups. Such work challenges the universal theories of socialization by highlighting cultural differences in understandings of parenting, in parenting behaviors, and in the effects of those behaviors. So that's from a review of hundreds of studies and so on, to do with adolescence in this particular case. But what happens is that people simply go on refining the measures. It doesn't lead to change in the theorization other than refinement. So here's Boehmrind saying standardizing the meaning of the authoritative parenting pattern. So in 2013, she is still working on this, and so are many other people. And what it does here, while work in the Galtonian legacy fixes people, this fixes constructs, and it serves to maintain the white middle classes as normative parents. The many exceptions by ethnicity and social class don't trouble the theory at all, and it's one of the ways in which there's a dynamic fixity of constructs, a refinement, not a challenge, and as I've said already, a normalized absence, pathologized presence. I want to move on swiftly to thinking about unconscious bias. And here to argue that there is certainly a maintenance of the status quo here. Now, unconscious bias, as tested by things like the implicit association test, is certainly built on long histories of work in things like social identity theory, the self-categorization approach, entitativity, all sorts of things like that. Okay, and what it shows, and many of us will have had training on unconscious bias. So, for example, only last week I was on a British Academy panel thinking about grants, grant applications. And before we were allowed to say how we'd scored, well, before we did it, we were sent a link to look at a video that the Royal Society had produced on unconscious bias. But when we sat all together, we were also shown the video to make sure that we knew that there was unconscious bias. The reason that that's important is, of course, the British Academy, like everywhere else in academia, reproduces people who are, and grants to people who are white, middle class, and who come from what in Britain is called the Golden Triangle of universities. And that Golden Triangle is Oxford, Cambridge, and London. Okay? So there's a huge proportion of members of the British Academy who come from there, and of the people who get grants who come from those universities. So we were shown this video on unconscious bias. And of course, that's really important. It's important to think about it. So in what I'm saying, I'm not decrying thinking about unconscious bias and recognizing its importance at all. I'm simply saying it has other impacts too. And one of the impacts is complacency. So Keon West, who is at Goldsmiths College and an experimental psychologist, says that it's amazing how often when he's given people this test and so on, they've said things like, "Thank you, you've shown me that it's not my fault. What a relief." Okay? And one of the things that he argues is that it takes away focus on the damage that bias can cause. And it takes away focus on the fact that there is also conscious bias as well as unconscious bias. But it leaves racism unaddressed, and it constitutes an evasion of responsibility, because you don't have to do anything. We cannot help it being biased. And one of the things that does is to fix the self in an interesting way. so that people who feel that it's natural for them to have that bias and so they can't change, fix themselves, whether they're white and middle class or whether they're black and thinking that they can't help being biased against, I don't know, people with disabilities or to do with sexuality or gender more broadly, that actually it fixes the self. And it does that, and it does it partly in order to avoid claims to change social arrangements, but the outcome is to avoid claims to change social arrangements from the other. And it can certainly also, the training can be counterproductive. So Alexandra Kalev, who's a professor of sociology at Tel Aviv, says that from her research, she finds that actually companies that do unconscious bias training, in the 12 months afterwards, appoint fewer women and minority ethnic groups to management jobs, which she found absolutely astonishing. And she suggests that efforts to get people to suppress their stereotypes can actually work to reinforce them. Okay? And the process through which this happens is, she says, is if training tells us we're all biased, there's no need to make an effort, and making an effort will make no difference anyway. And then that many businesses see the training as an end in itself. It's a quick solution to their discrimination problems. They don't have to do anything else. Okay, so quickly, algorithms. Thank you. I was just getting nervous about the time, but thank you for that reassurance. And here, Lauren Daly, writing a piece in Catalyst, talks about the way in which artificial intelligence is ubiquitous. And we all know this, in everything from credit score calculators to search engine results to what we see on social media, recruitment, talent management, and so on. And she says more and more evidence indicates that humans are programming their own biases, including around gender and race, into the algorithms behind AI. And she says, and she gives many, many examples. I've taken just one. Algorithms used in courtrooms to conduct risk assessments about defendants are racially biased. It predicts that the likelihood that defendants will commit future crimes, and its assessments are used throughout the criminal justice process. So it influences how much you need to pay in order to get out of jail at that moment, and so on. And she says a recent study found that the forecasts were unreliable and skewed to flag black defendants at almost twice the rate as white defendants as likely to commit future crimes. Black defendants were found to not actually re-offend at the rates predicted. The programs made the opposite error for white defendants, giving them lower risk scores. Meanwhile, researchers found that they went on to commit future crimes at a higher rate than predicted. These differences could not be explained by prior criminal records, age, or gender. Okay. And as Caroline Criado-Perez suggests, and Caroline Criado-Perez is quite interesting because she suggested that there should, in Britain, be Jane Austen, a woman on the, was it the £5 note, people who are British, or was it the more, £5? Okay, on the £5 note. And what absolutely astonished her and many other people were the death threats, the threats of rape, the vitriol. She has a fantastically bigger post bag than you could possibly imagine, all of it about what people would like to do to her, because she dared to suggest that a woman should be on the £5 note that hardly anybody uses anymore. But anyway, she has written a book called Invisible Women, Exposing Data Bias in a World Designed for Men. And she says, these silences, these gaps have consequences. They impact on women's lives every day. The impact can be relatively minor, struggling to reach a top shelf set at a male height norm. And I have to thank the people who are the technicians at the back, because the very first thing that, sorry, remind me of your name? Thank you. Said to me last night was, you're not very tall. And I waited to see what would happen next, but what he did was put this down. Because, of course, if you've got fixed podia, they are very much designed for, well, what do you think they're designed for? Tiny women? No. So I really want to thank you for your care and making sure that you could all see me today, even though I'm so very tall. So Caroline Criado Perez says, you know, irritating certainly, but not life-threatening. Not like crashing in a car whose safety tests don't account for women's measurements. And you'd be astonished to learn that it's, oh my goodness, 5 minutes to go. Okay, so I won't give the example. Not like dying from a stab wound because your police body armor doesn't fit you properly. For these women, the consequences of living in a world built around male data can be deadly. Okay, I think you've got the point. I'm going to skip other examples. This book by Safia Noble, Algorithms of Oppression, contests the fantasy that the internet is an equalizing device. And she argues that code is power, and white, and male. Okay. So that's nothing to do with psychology, but of course it is, because psychologists do research in these areas, and they're also as fascinated with big data as everybody else. And it's crucially important to bear in mind how big data is produced. It's also an illustration of why we need non-essentialist insider perspectives and why those matter. So I'm going to move on. As you can see, it's number 3 now, possibilities for change. First of all, rethinking statistics. And here, pointing out simply that statistics were produced in a eugenic era on the basis of wanting to prove eugenics claims. And that's really important. So, just a quick quote, many statistical techniques we take for granted were developed for and used in eugenics research, including t-tests, discriminant analysis, and even our modern form of simple linear regression. For example, significant difference. And this is from Nathaniel Jocelyn, who's a statistics graduate in South Africa, and who's made it his business to learn about the history of statistics and to see it as part of see what he's interested in doing as part of a decolonial project. So he says in Pearson's Annals of Eugenics, he had to pick and choose measures of genetic inferiority to ensure that his conclusion that Jews are an inferior race would be satisfied. This was difficult because initially he had measured income and saving as proxies for genetic superiority, and indeed something that black people at the time didn't do much from the end of enslavement and so on. But he found that Jews did, so he had to change it. Okay? He had to change what were the negative traits. And what Nathaniel Jocelyn, pictured there, says is these tests, well, I think I'll skip this actually, otherwise it takes too long to go into. But those things developed to prove such hypotheses as there's significant difference in personal cleanliness between white and non-white children, never mind the fact that disproving one hypothesis doesn't necessarily prove the other to be true. And he argues in this blog that post-colonial understanding of statistical significance relies on holistic understanding of the data in question and the mathematical properties of the population that generated it. This is knowledge discovery, not hypothesis testing. This is interdisciplinary research, not isolated extrapolation by inherently biased human beings. And this is timely, I think, because for psychology at the moment, significance tests have fallen out of favor. We are told not to do significance testing anymore because it's not helpful in really understanding differences. It's partly come out of the replication crisis that we have to rethink statistics, but it's a good moment to think about where particular ways of thinking about statistics have come from and what their implications are, and doing something new and decolonial. So I am coming to the end, and I wanted to end by thinking about insider resistance. And again, I move away from psychology to think about Toni Morrison, since she's recently died. And she addresses how, as a black woman writer, she's had to struggle with and through, and I quote, a language that can powerfully evoke and enforce hidden signs of racial superiority, cultural hegemony, and dismissive othering of people and language. And that comes from her book of essays, Playing in the Dark. And I want to point out that inside us, both is dynamic, so there are shifting alliances that are important when we think about issues, but it's also not color-coded. Nathaniel Jocelyn, who I just showed you, is clearly an insider to the decolonial project. And I don't know why I put unlike Trump. I must have been feeling something at the time. Anyway, so it's not color-coded and it's complex. And I'd like to end with Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who I think is a fantastic writer, whose every writing I like. And this is a TED Global talk in 2009, where she talks about the fact that she was quite old before she realized that black people could be in books. She was an avid reader, you can imagine. She's such a fantastic writer. She read voraciously as a child, but it took her some time to realize that you could have black people in books. And then she discovered African writers. And she says, what this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Now, I loved those American and British books I read. They stirred my imagination. They opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. So what the discovery of African writers did for me was this. It saved me from having a single story of what books are. Okay? And I'd like to end. I'll leave this up, and if you want to make any comments, ask questions, please do. Okay.